is running, love is running, dystopian dream. Yeah.
So I suppose, I mean, a couple of years ago, in April 2013, I think it was, I had a pretty awful year because my dad passed away. A few months before that, Panditji Ravi Shankar died, and I was there by his bedside when he passed away, and I was with Anushka Shankar, whose album I was producing at the time, and it was quite a dark period for both of us because, in fact, we wrote a track together on her album called Fathers. And I think there was a lot that I was feeling about loss and kind of isolation, and I think because of the traumatic nature of how my dad passed away as well, it was quite a violent passing. Because of that, I kind of felt very strongly about expressing something that I hadn't expressed before, and I think a lot of stuff came through in the lyrics and the ideas, and the title itself is about that kind of I suppose that line between life and death, and kind of also wondering where the spirit of my dad ended up. And there was a lot of that kind of thing, but then it's, as a result, I think the album's kind of a lot about self-questioning, a lot about questioning identity. It's quite a dark album in a lot of ways, but it's also, I think it's also a hopeful album, and it's kind of just an album that came out of a quite a dark feeling, and I feel has gone somewhere quite positive. It's a very cathartic album. I think any album should be cathartic. I think any art should start from a place of catharsis and expression, and then you share it with other people. I think if it starts from the point of view of thinking of it in relation to communication, then I think it's not really art, because you want to find your own feelings and your own soul in any piece of art that you do, rather than trying to appease other people when you start making music or anything artistic. I suppose, I mean, I kind of was also looking out at a lot of things. For example, what was going on in Gaza, you know, with certain events where I think I was surprised by the way in which certain world events were reported in relation to the whole the conflict between Israel and Gaza, or the Palestinians. It was reported as a war, and I kind of thought, well, this didn't feel to me like a war, given that only 2 people in Israel had died, and thousands were killed in Gaza. You know, the whole thing with the Iron Dome, meaning that everyone in Israel was protected, and everyone in Gaza, I mean, Gaza was basically a wasteland at the end of it, and the average age, as Jon Snow pointed out in a Channel 4 presentation that he did, you know, the average age was 17 years old, so there were a lot of children killed. And I kind of thought, well, this goes beyond politics. This is something that's about a humanitarian disaster and tragedy, and yet the world wasn't reporting it as that, and it felt more like a massacre than it did, and it was genocide basically, and the world stood by and reported it, you know, under the guise of being unbiased. The world seemed to be reporting it as something that was equal, an actual war, and it wasn't for me. So for example, there were other things, and I guess probably because I was so close to death that year. I mean, you know, lots of people I knew passed away. It was a weird year. You know, there was our monitor engineer who'd been with us for many years. He passed away in a sudden shock incident, and then also a very good friend of mine, Paul Bhattacharjee, who was playing Tagore in a play that I'd written for the Barbican. He actually passed away. In fact, he committed suicide that year. So it was a really difficult year, and I suppose I had a heightened feeling about death and about injustice, and so I kind of think that you know, that was it gave me a different prism through which I was looking at world events, having been so close and personal with a lot of things that happened that were quite tragic. I don't think it's important for me to bring politics into music. What I do feel is that it's important to distill your feelings into something. Musically, as an artist, I have a symbiotic relationship with society and with world events and with personal events, and I think it's irresponsible if you don't pay any attention to the world around you when you're making music. It kind of feels like a natural thing for me. I'm always thinking, and the way I think is I'm always looking at what's going on in the world, and I'm always thinking about what troubles me or what makes me feel uncomfortable, and that could be on a personal level, or that can be on a world, on a global level. It is interesting that I actually went on record with Channel 4 News talking about how UKIP had got into power at one point through Mark Reckless in Rochester, which is where I grew up, and it's interesting for me how whenever there is any kind of recession or anything like that, the first thing that happens is, particularly with right-wing parties, and or the more right-wing parties, they tend to very swiftly try and scapegoat immigrants, even though economically it's been proven that immigrants are a net benefit to the country. In fact, there was a UCL study which clearly showed, I think it was about a year ago, that there was a £20 billion net benefit to the economy through immigration at the time. So it's really interesting that there's almost a default position of saying, well, we all know immigration is bad for the country, and it's actually not the case at all. And people like James O'Brien actually kind of were very good at exposing the hypocrisy and the nonsense of this when he actually challenged on radio on LBC at one point anybody to phone in and actually explain why they thought, for example, the European Court was a bad thing, or even when he had Nigel. God, he's gone out of my head now. Yeah, God, he just suddenly went out of my head. That's a good thing. And Nigel Farage came in, and they had an interview together, and I remember that he kind of was really good at exposing his hypocrisy, particularly in relation to when he said that he felt uncomfortable on a train next to Romanians speaking their own language, when he actually is married to a German woman with children who speak German, presumably, and he was saying it's really uncomfortable with people speaking foreign languages, and when James O'Brien kind of said, well, what's the difference with your children and your wife who presumably speaks German, he said, well, you know the difference between Romanians and Germans. I mean, making a clearly racist implication that and for me that was racism, and this is what I mean. It's kind of it surprises me that some of the politicians who've been chosen almost to represent working classes have been so incredibly clever at manipulating people's fear. And you get great political writers like Noam Chomsky who talk about the idea that you can actually, in order to maintain power, it's one of the best things you can do is create an atmosphere of fear among the populace, so that they go running to the government to save them from this concept of what Edward Said called the other. That, like in Orientalism, if anyone's read that book, then they know about this idea that there's this concept perpetuated in the West of the other, and that they're somehow the enemy. And I think that's what people prey on when they try to make it seem as if immigrants are in some way to blame for the economic recession, which is a totally separate issue altogether. I think it's harder and harder for Asian artists emerging nowadays. I think it's shocking how still there is not a proper balance in the media. I mean, for me, much as it's a strange thing because I support the Asian Network. I think it's a great thing, but at the same time, for me, unfortunately, when you have something like the Asian Network, you have an excuse for for the media and for the BBC not to actually give an equal platform on mainstream radio to Asians. And I think it's the same case with categories like world music, where you have marginalisation and a kind of cultural apartheid in relation to music that's from what they would call minority communities. I think what happens is that it becomes the case that even if you're you create mainstream music, but you happen to be a minority in a minority group, then you're immediately thought of as creating something they would call world music, or that your music should be on the Asian network as opposed to Radio 2 or Radio 1. And I remember when I was asked if I wanted to have a radio show of mine, and I said, well, I'd like to do it on Radio 2, BBC Radio 2, as opposed to having doing something with the Asian network. Much as I think the Asian network's a great thing, and there's some great DJs on there, and they do all kinds of good work. And Bobby Friction's show I was on the other day was really good fun. But I think the BBC has more of a responsibility to have shows like Bobby Friction's or Nihal's or people like that actually on mainstream Radio 1, and to change the culture so that people have more of an understanding and acceptance of the integration of other cultures into mainstream society, as opposed to kind of just constantly thinking of it as something that's over there that we can ignore and not think about. No, I don't feel pigeonholed as an ethnic artist in any way, because I've made an incredibly huge effort to make sure that didn't happen. I think it sometimes happens with me, but I'm very, very lucky. I mean, I write music for mainstream films. I play mainstream festivals now. Luckily, I was just talking to you earlier on about Glastonbury, but we also played Latitude this year. We play on the main stage where I sold out the Royal Albert Hall many times, and the Roundhouse. I can't ever turn around and say I'm a marginalised artist, and at the moment I'm working on this huge blockbuster for Warner Brothers, so I can't ever say, oh, I'm marginalised. I'm very lucky, but at the same time, I think that from the position that I'm in, I sit on the board of the Ivor Novello Awards, and I'm quite often in situations where I kind of I've judged for the BAFTAs and BIFA and all kinds of other organisations that are kind of quite established. I think it's really important to be able to point out to everyone that there is not a balanced representation proportionally of minority groups in mainstream media, to be talking about just music, and I think we should. But I mean, my point is that it is the way things are, and it's what I think happened was before 2001. I think things were shifting. I mean, you had Talvin won the Mercury Music Prize in 1999. I got nominated in 2000. ADF, it was kind of the case that a lot, people called it the Asian Underground, but a lot of Asian acts were getting signed by mainstream record companies. Warner Brothers signed UMA for a major deal. There were all kinds of things. I was one of the writers and one of the creators on Goodness Gracious Me at that time, and the BBC gave us our own very mainstream slot, and there were lots of things like that going on. Now I kind of think, since in a way you could kind of blame 9/11 for it, I think that kind of allowed that kind of became an excuse for political opportunism, where I think a lot of people who had maybe suppressed their kind of subliminal racism, they became quite confident to speak more openly about their kind of racist perspectives, and I think that really infiltrated into the mainstream, and unfortunately I think rather than fighting against it, politicians embraced that kind of racism, and I think that's what's happened ever since. I worked with the BBC recently with for example, I was working with the 10 Pieces classical music project recently for the BBC, but I've also I've done access to music and different programs. That's true. I think it's very important for kids to have. I mean, music is a great way to express your feelings, and I think also it's a great way to organise your mind, and it's also brilliant for self-discipline. There's all kinds of benefits with music, and I think there's even proven relationships between delaying or even kind of curing, well, not curing, but actually beneficial effects of learning music at a late stage in life on diseases like Alzheimer's disease and anything that's to do with mental health. So it's quite, I think it's a very important thing for kids to learn. And it's a great way of sharing an idea. I mean, if you're working with other kids rather than a competitive environment like with sport or with any of the subjects where you're in competition, I think when you're playing with other people, music is about teamwork and collaboration to create something beautiful, and I think that's an amazing thing. However you perceive beauty, it's an incredibly collaborative exercise to work with other musicians. I think that's a fantastic thing. It was great to produce Traces of You, and I mean, I've known Anushka for quite a while now, and I'm godfather to her son Zubin, and she's a brilliant musician, an unbelievably brilliant musician. She was at the launch actually the other day, and she's I think she's really she's got the spirit of her father in her playing and in her way of thinking, and I think she's she's one of my favourite musicians, and I've performed live with her, and she's performed on my albums and actually performed with me live, and I think we've just got a very good friendship and a very good musical bond as well, which I think works really well. This album is kind of it's a cross section of different perspectives on how I look at music now, I suppose. I mean, I think since my last album and since I've been working in the industry, I've in recent years, over the last 4 years, I've had my own radio show, and I've been probably listening more to music than I have done for a very long time. And I think a lot of that influence is kind of clear on this album, because I think I'm working across lots of contemporary sounds and flavours, but it's very much me, and it's very much coming from the way I look at music generally and look at life generally. But I think this album has got some fantastic singers on. I mean, it's got everyone from Joss Stone to some very young, exciting talent like Jay Dana, who's just 19, or Stealth, who's just 21, and then there's also some great Indian classical vocals. There's there's rap on it. There's all kinds of things. It's an exciting album from my point of view to have produced and to have written, but I think people will not be able to get bored listening to the album. I think it's a journey, and it's very much about an album's journey rather than a collection of singles. I'm not really interested in creating one-off pieces of music. I'm more like a novelist than a short story writer, so this is definitely like a novel. Well, like I was saying, I'm probably going to be working over the next couple of months on some more stuff for Jungle Book Origins, which is a huge film for Warner Brothers. It's got Christian Bale and Benedict Cumberbatch and Cate Blanchett and Naomi Harris and Frida Pinto and Andy Serkis. So it's a huge cast, and that's going to be coming out in a couple of years. But there's a lot of work to be done on it, and I'm kind of writing the orchestral score as well as recording some session work. I already was in South Africa with it, which was a great thing to happen. But on top of that, I'm touring at the moment. I'm going to be touring the album around the country, and then on top of that, I've just produced Nicky Wells' debut album, which hopefully will come out sometime next year. I also worked with producing and writing music for the band Bond, the string quartet Bond, and also Helene Grimaud, who's a classical pianist, one of the top classical pianists in the world. I just produced her album, and I'll be probably producing a couple more albums quite soon for people like Jay Dana, where we're talking about doing some work together. But on top of all that, I'll be doing the next radio series as well, and this year I've filmed Guitar Star, and I might be doing some other TV work like that. So there's a lot going on. And one other thing is I'm going over to India in December to do a TED talk, about a TEDx talk about the relationship between music and mathematics, which is something I've always been interested in. But it'll be good doing it in Bombay, and I think it's the biggest TEDx in the whole of Asia. So that's really exciting to me. Well, actually, I mean, it's because I work a lot with Akram Khan, and so that does interest me that he talks about that. But I've always been really interested in mathematics since I was very young. And for example, I wrote the music about for a theatre production about Ramanujan, who was one of the greatest mathematicians of the last century, who came up with a lot of the mathematics that goes into string theory and stuff like that. But I really love maths. You know, and I think there's a lot of it's been really useful, that relationship for me with mathematics. I mean, some people might say it's quite geeky, but it's actually really good, because if you do understand maths, you can do all kinds of things for video games and stuff like that. It's quite useful in terms of techniques and different ways to engage. You know, one of the things I'm talking about is even when I wrote the music for the London Symphony Orchestra for a Hitchcock silent movie, I had to use mathematics there, and I think part of it is because I had a love for Vedic mathematics from the Vedas. There's this whole idea of the 16 sutras, which are actually all about how you can actually use mathematical techniques to do fast mental arithmetic and different types of ways of looking at the relationship between mathematics and even rhythm and stuff like that, and patterns. So I quite enjoy all of that, and that's one of the things I'll be talking about.